I would like to talk with you a little bit today about cognitive behavioral therapy from the point of view of cognitive psychology, cognition in the brain, and also particularly about neuropsychology as well. So this is the first of several parts on these topics. The brain and how it works influences, of course, our entire bodily system. When we talk about the neuroscience of the brain, we don't just talk about just the physical part of the brain, but how the entire neurological parts of the body also connect. So we can say that the brain actually includes all of our nervous system as well. When we talk about cognition, we're interested in the way that thoughts are formed, how they're maintained, but also how they're discontinued. We have questions sometimes about our thinking, what causes our thoughts, what holds our thoughts together, what happens that our thoughts will change, what do we do with our environment, and how does it affect how we think? These are all concerns that people have. Cognitive psychology is a way in which we understand the mental processes of our thought process and how we interpret the world. How the brain does this is really the domain of cognitive psychology. Neuropsychology is more the study of how the brain is structured and how the structure affects the functioning, whereas cognitive psychology is more of the actual functioning of the mental processes. In cognitive therapy, that's our area that we're going to be mostly interested in cognitive behavioral therapy, is the study of the levels of our thinking and how that affects our emotional functioning and our behavior. When we want to understand the structure of the brain, the neuroscience of the brain, basically the neuroscientists have divided the brain into three parts, although they're not fully distinct from each other, they all interact. We have the reptilian complex, the Limbic System, and of course the Neocortex. So if we look at the brain, we can see these different areas, how the neurocortex, it goes around the outside of the brain. It's very large in human beings, not so big in some other animals. The structure, it also has a function. The neocortex, of course, is the higher brain functions in mammals and in humans, of course, and it also has a nurturing function. We have empathy, we have compassion, we have loyalty, lifelong bonding, we can connect with our community, we have a moral awareness and self-realization. The limbic system in lower mammals, birds particularly, for example, they're able to distinguish the sounds of their own young. They can distinguish distress, pleasure and pain. They're able to read their body signals for mating and other functions. But they're not terribly good at empathy. They have impulses to nurture. They provide food and protection to their young. They teach them some basic survival mechanisms. In the reptile, now this part of the brain is not so well developed. It just regulates the involuntary functions of how we're breathing, the body temperature, feeding, the metabolism, instinctual reproduction, and it does have a fight, flight, and startle response, but it abandons their young pretty early in life. There's a story about turtles in Hawaii that I learned about on one of my trips there when I was giving some seminars. I took a tour around the island of Oahu, and when we got to the North Shore, the guide, who was wonderful, her name was Patty, she really understood the many things about the island, and she was a great teacher. She told a story about a particular turtle in Hawaii by the name of Honey Girl that had been unfortunately killed by a group of visitors, I guess, to that part of the island. And her mate came and sat on top of her grave for several days, not eating. This was a sign of loving kindness and compassion that we can understand. This happened in October 2010 on the North Shore. But there are other stories of how animals can be kind and compassionate to each other. There's a story about a hippo and a turtle. The hippo was, this was after a tsunami. The hippo was separated from his mom, but found this turtle, and the tortoise took care of the hippo. Very touching. Sometimes on PBS you'll see stories of how animals are getting along with each other and nurturing each other from different species. If only humans could sometimes realize that we shouldn't be so picky about the fact that we have individual differences. We need to get rid of all of our bias and prejudices. As I talk to you right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic. In addition to that, we're also having protests about racism in America. So maybe we could learn some things from our other inhabitants of the planet. The limbic system is very complicated. It has many different parts, but we're mostly interested in the fact that we have this amygdala that is very responsive to distress, and this amygdala is a part of the brain that is highly tuned to whenever negativity takes place. We say it's the repository for negative emotions, fear, and aggression. And we have another part of the brain that does the opposite, that actually tunes into pleasure and happiness and peacefulness. This is called the nucleus accumbens. These are internal areas of the limbic system. There's also an area called the cingulate, divided into the anterior portion and the posterior portion. The anterior part keeps us in the here and now, and the posterior portion actually is very active when the mind is wandering. And between the limbic system and the cortex, there's another thin layer which is called the insula. The insula has quite a number of very important functions that we've just learned about in the last few years. So as we see, the cortex is also divided into different parts for our study. We have the back of the brain, we have the occipital region, we have the parietal region, we have the temporal region, we have the frontal region, and the prefrontal cortex. All of these parts have different functions. And we used to look at the brain and see that certain areas of the brain were very specific for certain functions. Now we see that the brain actually interacts with different parts and forms neural networks. So it's not just one area of the brain that is responsible for certain behaviors or responses. When we look at love, for example, we notice that actually love is something that is, we can follow it inside the limbic system. The area of the brain that gets activated is the hippocampus that produces the dopamine, and this dopamine floods certain areas of the brain, like the nucleus accumbens, all this pleasure that we begin to feel when we're in love, and then it activates another area of the brain, which is the amygdala. Oh, something could go wrong. This person might not love me back. I could be rejected and hurt. We also store information about the meaningfulness of this person in an area called the VTA, which acts like a photo album of all of the people that we have loved during our life. But then, when we make a commitment to someone, the ventral pallidum becomes more actively involved. So that we can see that this brain is very important when we talk about love, for example. We have to be careful about anger. We don't want the anger. Even when we love someone, we can lose control of our irritability and anger, and that can be the overactivation of the amygdala, and we want to be very careful about that. It can also bring about what's called the negativity bias that we'll be talking more about. In cognitive psychology, which is the study of how the mind and brain function together, this is yet another topic that we'll be talking about in more detail in the future. So I want to thank you all very much for your attention, and we'll be able to discuss this in more detail in some of our other talks. Thank you.